Hello, and welcome to A Lady Well Traveled. I'm your host and creator, Shannon Bednarova, and I'm delighted that you've joined me. Today, we're going to be interviewing a gentleman by the name of Denny Frazier. Denny is a dive instructor and a dive master who currently works at the Carolina Dive Locker in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And that's where we're recording today. So I want to give a shout out to the owner, Jeff Edenberg, and Carolina Dive Locker is located at 1303 Ben Sawyer in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. If you're a diver, even if you're a snorkeler and you need equipment, just check them out. So, Denny, would you please say hello to everybody that's listening today?
Hello, everybody out there. And I want to thank you for tuning in to Shannon's podcast. And thank you for having me on.
Absolutely.
I think this is going to be a blast.
We're going to have a great time. Yeah, the first time I met Denny, I came in because I was going to be going scuba diving after a long reprieve after having had a boating accident where I got chopped up in a propeller. And hey, I can still play the violin, so that's a good thing. But Denny helped me pick out a new snorkel, and he was so gracious and kind, talking to me about replenishing coral. And I said, hey, I really need to have you on my podcast. So here we are. Denny, you've led a very, very storied life. You've traveled all over the world for work, for your volunteerism, and for your diving. You're also a dive photographer, which is something that's really wonderful. Would you tell our audience briefly about your background, where you're from, your career path, and just some fun things about you like pina coladas and walking in the rain and all that?
Yes, I do like pina coladas, but actually I prefer a good margarita.
Okay.
And in terms of being chopped up, it looked like you pulled all your pieces together. So I'm glad that you are still mobile and getting around.
Amen to that. God is good.
Yep. Well, I better make this brief because I've been on the planet for a while. At any rate, my interest in basically outdoors and nature really started as a young man. I joined the Air Force when I was 19, became a survival SEER instructor. And so for 10 years, I walked around the woods of the Pacific Northwest, but traveled in many different biomes from the tropics to the Arctic. And I ended up getting a degree in biology, chemistry for secondary education. Never really fulfilled that because I had an opportunity to become an officer in the Air Force and then traveled the world for the next 10 years and eventually ended up in the Philippines. And while I was in the Philippines, I had an opportunity to learn how to dive. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Since then, have traveled quite extensively. Bonaire was my favorite go-to place, but my wife and I have traveled to the Maldives, Egypt, Philippines, Indonesia, and multiple places throughout the Caribbean. And so with that, and then having a love of nature, then photography came very naturally. I had an opportunity to learn some photography while in Bonaire and then really refine that when I took a trip to Indonesia and the Philippines.
That's awesome. You said that when you were in the Philippines with the Air Force, you got into diving. We all have this story about how I started diving. You got certified in the Philippines. Tell me how that evolved.
Well, I had an office looking over the South China Sea.
Oh, wow.
And just imagine this very iconic place with palm trees. You could hear the ocean crashing against the coral. I mean, we were right on the edge of it.
I can imagine.
Looking out over the South China Sea. To the north, to the west, and to the south was nothing but ocean, every place I looked. And because of some political unrest at that time, we were restricted to base. However, I found out that they were going to have a scuba class. And if I left the shore of the base and returned back to the base, then I would be able to get off base and go dive. And then I had a friend, of course, that everybody has a dive friend that says, you absolutely got to do this. And so Mike was that friend that strongly encouraged me to take the class.
That's great. So when did you decide, hey, I'm pretty good at this. I'm going to learn how to teach others and become an instructor and a master.
Well, that was a little longer route.
Okay.
So as I was in the Philippines, I had an opportunity to basically eat, sleep, and dive, and I focused on that. And so after a year, I had over 100 dives, and then I had worked with this one dive instructor who needed a dive master, and basically said, if you help me out, I can help you become a dive master. And so we did. And that was a terrific experience.
Oh, yes.
And led me to be able to dive down in the Verde Straits near Batangas and see some of the most incredible diving that the Philippines had to offer.
Wow, that's so cool. Did your love of diving come first, and then you were like, I have to learn how to take pictures of all of this groovy stuff I'm seeing? Or were you already somewhat of a photographer or a great photographer, and you said, I'm taking this underwater?
Well, I'll never claim to be a great photographer.
Oh, come on.
I make some really terrific images.
Okay.
And I'm getting a little more accomplished as I do that. But what actually happened was I grew up watching Jacques Cousteau.
Oh, of course. Didn't we
and
all?
The underwater world. And I just felt
Absolutely.
like I needed to capture that to be able to share with others. And because I had already been a SEER instructor, but during that time, I started teaching a lot of outdoor adventurous activities like river rafting,
Oh, yeah.
kayaking, canoeing, worked with the scouts extensively. And being an educator, I wanted to be able to talk about and get people to connect with what it was that I was doing. So much so, I think my family got tired of seeing fish pictures and wanted to see pictures of these exotic locations that I was going in. That was the impetus for that.
Okay.
Don't you find it really hard to connect with folks that haven't had the experience to get underwater, and you try to explain to them what it was like to experience that school of hammerheads or those nurse sharks or the octopus that was crawling along the bottom and feeding? It's just really hard because those are not common experiences for
Right.
our families and friends.
Right. And having a sea lion come right up to your mask, this gigantic 600-pound creature that's really like a puppy dog in the ocean, or snorkeling or scuba diving along and just being in it's hard to call sea turtles a herd, but when you've got like 6 or 7 of them right there, it's wonderful.
Well, and the other thing I love about the ocean is that we get away from this concrete world that we
Yes.
live in, and we're in some other creature's universe.
Yes.
And we are truly visiting. I mean,
Mhm.
we have to be supported by scuba equipment.
Right.
And if you're adventurous and if you end up swimming next to a whale shark, you just realize we're not the biggest creature in the world.
That's right. We're really at the mercy of those sea creatures, aren't we? Oh,
Absolutely.
let me ask you about your scuba shop experience. You're an expert at scuba equipment repair. And was that something that you picked up by virtue of diving so much, or was it something that you wanted to learn and you taught yourself how to do it with like YouTube videos or just through experience?
Yeah, that was, well, just going back to my background,
Okay.
being SEER
Yeah.
instructor, and then trying to always be in the position where you could support yourself.
Mhm.
And then diving with scuba equipment at these foreign locations where many times there wasn't a scuba shop. I just had a real interest in what I might be able to do in terms of repairing my equipment and continuing to work. I basically started hanging out at a scuba shop that had burnt down, unfortunately, here in Charleston.
Okay.
Charleston Scuba with a fellow by the name of Gary Finca. And Gary, if you're listening out there, thank you for everything you've done to help
Hey,
me
Gary.
learn. But he took the time to show me how to repair my own equipment. And so at the bench, we were working and repairing it. But if you're not affiliated with the scuba shop, you can't buy the service kits because they only sell the service kits to the shops that actually carry that equipment. When I had an opportunity to move over to Carolina Dive Locker, they had a need for someone to do servicing of equipment. And then Jeff was gracious enough to sign me up for some courses.
Mhm.
So I learned how to repair Sherwood regulators online, taking e-learning classes.
Mhm.
And then I took the classes through Scuba Pro, and
Oh,
that
yeah.
was directed online, but everybody was rebuilding a regulator online with an instructor giving us feedback.
Mm-hmm.
And then went to DEMA, the Dive Equipment Manufacturing Association,
Wow.
a conference, and
Woo!
actually went to a class there to learn how to rebuild Mara's equipment. And so it continues.
Yeah.
And did the same for OTS masks. And we're looking forward to bringing on Aqualung
Oh,
repair
yes.
here in the shop.
Very nice.
And hopefully in not the too distant future, we hope to also be repairing Atomic and that fleet of equipment as well.
Okay. Well, that's great news. My brother is a retired firefighter, but also dove for Henrico County and was on the MERT team. What do firefighter teams and police departments have to do? Are they given special dispensation and given those kits, or do they have to bring everything to the dive shop too?
No, they're going to need to have some kind of a certified technician. And it
Okay.
really depends. For example, I know that
They have divers.
the South Carolina Aquarium, they do have a service tech that will take care of their equipment. On some dive teams, they will have equipment people, but generally, like we will have many of the police departments and firefighter teams bring their equipment in for annual servicing here at our shop.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Well, and part of that is you also need to have recurring training to keep up with that, but also specialized tools.
Oh, yeah.
In order to work on that.
I can imagine. They're not exactly the same thing that you use to fix your fire truck. Or let's get into you becoming involved in working with coral restoration, and that's specifically in Bonaire. Tell our audience how you got involved. What was the impetus for that?
Well, after diving around the world and having been diving since 1990, I've been able to see how the climate has had an impact with coral bleaching, with marine heat waves that have definitely had a major impact. And as the coral begins to bleach, if the water stays warm enough for a long enough period of time, then the microorganisms that help the coral to survive leave that coral, and then the coral will eventually die off. And you'll see these coral barrens where it's just nothing but white staghorn coral. And over time, those will begin to break down. And since the coral is a keystone species, then you don't have the smaller fish, then you don't have the snappers and groupers. And then the next thing you know, it's just very small fish that are algae eaters eating around the edges, and it becomes a lot less vibrant. I also listened to a TED Talk that was given by Sylvia Earle, one of my absolute most favorite people in the world. And Sylvia Earle, an oceanographer, terrific marine biologist, she started like 3 submersible companies in the world, but in her TED Talk, she had one ask as she was receiving this award, and that was that we would take a portion of the ocean and set it aside for marine protected areas. And then she had an ask for everyone: go out there, talk to your congressman, get involved. If you have social media platforms, start holding this up that we really need to protect the oceans, and we could do that if we were able to set aside somewhere between 10 to 30% of the ocean for restoration purposes. And so when I heard that because of the climate changes that were coming, that somewhere near 2030, 90% of the coral reefs could disappear on the planet as one of our tipping points.
Wow.
Then I had to get out and see it for myself. And once I started seeing it, and seeing is believing, then I knew that I needed to do something. I just felt compelled. I mean, I love nature, being in nature. Coral reefs only make up somewhere between like 0.1 to 0.2% of the ocean, but yet are so vital and critical for communities.
Absolutely. I know that you also had mentioned the disease that's affecting the coral called Stony coral tissue loss disease.
Isn't that a mouthful? Well, I got a better,
Sounds like
I got a better one.
venereal disease.
So, working with the coral conservationists, they have abbreviated it and they call it Skittle D.
Skittle D. I like that.
So like Skittles,
Yeah.
only with a
With
D
a
at the
D
end.
on it. Yeah.
So we can just refer to it as
Skittle
Skittle
D.
D.
I did some research and I found some data provided by NOAA. By the way, you can easily find this stuff on the internet. Skittle D is a highly infectious waterborne pathogen that causes rapid tissue loss and high mortality rates in over 20 species of hard corals throughout Florida and the Caribbean. And it's identified by white lesions, a bare skeleton. It spreads rapidly and it can kill total colonies in weeks. Denny, is this the same thing as coral bleaching? And if it's not, how are the two different?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. And they are different processes
Okay.
altogether.
Please explain for us.
So let's start with coral bleaching.
Okay.
Coral bleaching is going to happen when water temperatures rise typically 1 to 2 centigrade. That's probably 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit. And what happens is there is a symbiotic phytoplankton that the coral will bring into its tissues in order to help it with energy production.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, these phytoplankton are photosynthetic organisms that will convert materials that they collect in the seawater into carbohydrates that the corals use. And corals, particularly thinking of the branching corals, the like elkhorn coral and staghorn coral, they get up to 80% of their energy through this phytoplankton.
Okay.
Well, when the temperature gets that high, then they're continuing to produce oxygen and sugars and whatnot. But the oxygen content builds up so much it becomes an irritant
Okay.
to the coral. And the coral goes, I just can't handle this. And it ejects this phytoplankton back into the water column. The coral can survive maybe 2 to 4 weeks, depending upon the species, without this organism that lives within their tissue. But if we have marine heat waves like what Bonaire had experienced in 2023 and 24, and somewhat in 2025, then the corals really begin to suffer greatly. And depending upon where the coral's at and the water temperature, then you'll see these massive die-offs of the branching corals, particularly. And the elkhorn coral throughout the Florida Keys, Bahamas, and all the way down the Windward Islands took a very major hit this year. So how that is different from the Stony coral soft tissue disease, or Skittle D, is that this is a bacterial infection or maybe even a viral infection, but they're thinking that it might be a combination. What we'll see many times in biology is that you might end up with an initial bacterial infection, which sets the stage for another opportunistic infection to come in.
Yes, absolutely.
And so this was first identified in Miami. And weren't you going to ask me about ship ballasts?
I am. That's coming up.
Let's go there.
All right, let's go there then.
Okay, and then I'll tell the rest of the story.
Because they are looking at the reasons why this disease spreads so rapidly. And it spreads through the water and direct contact between the colonies, but then also potentially through contaminated ballast from ships. The water that's offloaded by ships that travels around the world all the time. The question I have for Denny is, how can we resolve that issue, offloading contaminated ballast? Because ships have been doing that ever since man has been going on the high seas. What do we do about this potentially contaminated ballast?
Okay, I'm gonna pick it up just a little bit before that. Where Skittle D first was identified was basically right off of Miami. Miami is one of the busiest shipping ports.
Yes, it is.
On the East Coast. It's either the first or the second highest used container ship ports in the nation.
And cruise ships, by the way.
And many people don't realize that about Miami, how big that port actually is. And so that's where the thought process came in. Maybe this was coming from the ballast of ships. Well, you can imagine that if you have a ship that might be coming out of the Balkans or maybe out of the Mediterranean or coming from the Indo-Pacific. I mean, we have so much trans-communication across our oceans,
Of course.
and these ships will take on ballast so that they'll sit lower in the water
Mhm.
column so that their propulsion systems are more effective and they're able to offset waves and whatnot.
Cavitation.
As
Yeah.
they become into ports, then they will offload their ballast because they need to raise the bottom of the ship so they could come into shipping canals in order to come into ports to be offloaded. We even see that here in South Carolina as we see the
Sure.
ships coming underneath the Ravenel
Mhm.
Bridge that they're sitting high in the water. The issue is if they are offloading that in areas like Biscayne Bay
Bay.
that
Yeah.
might be more contained, or even Charleston Harbor, which is even more contained, then whatever is in that water can mix with our water columns and hence contaminate.
Mhm.
And if you think a little bit like it could be like COVID. Maybe the origin was in China, and the next thing we know, it's in Seattle and
Of
then
course.
San Francisco and down in LA, and all these lines of communications are going to be sources of this happening. So many places will have requirements for ships to offload their ballasts before they enter into these more contained water columns. What they're doing in the maritime community, I'm not totally familiar with, but I
Mhm.
know that these practices have been put in place.
Right. And water moves. That's the thing. There are
Water
columns and currents everywhere. So if you offload your ballast, let's say in international waters 12 miles off the coast, that water can easily move into the bay or into the harbor in just a matter of
But I
weeks.
think the thinking there is the solution to pollution is dilution,
Yeah.
and that's has always been
Parts per gazillion, trillion,
how we
yes.
think of our oceans
Absolutely.
as being dumping grounds.
Yes.
But, yeah, it is of concern. But the reason why I asked you to go there
Yeah.
is because it helps to explain
Sure.
the movement of the stony coral disease because
Right.
it went from Miami to the
Right.
Florida Keys, and then it went down through the Bahamas,
Right.
and then because of the circular current that we have within the Gulf of Mexico
Mhm.
and the Caribbean, then the next thing we know, it's going down the Windward Islands, and then, from what, British Virgin Islands
Mhm.
down into Marquesa, St. Lucius, down Grenada, and then finally made its way to Bonaire. However, that track is very linear there, but we
Mhm.
also had an outbreak that happened off of the coast of Panama, and
Okay.
then also made its way into Jamaica and then also the Cayman
Like
Islands.
Boca del Toro area?
Yeah.
Huh? Well, I didn't know that. So, really interesting. They apply antibiotic pastes to the coral to treat this disease. Have you ever done any work applying any of the antibiotic pastes, or are you only involved in replenishment activities?
No, I didn't have an opportunity to apply the antibiotics, but this disease is so contagious
Yes.
that in order to apply the antibiotic, in order to save a reef, it would be very limited nature. And I think
Right.
it had more of a research component to it.
Okay.
By being able to apply the antibiotic to it, then they knew that there was a bacterial component to it.
Okay. Versus like everybody
Yeah.
going around with paintbrushes painting all the coral with antibiotic
Yeah, I
paste.
mean, but it just
It
doesn't
doesn't work that way.
biology doesn't
Oh,
work
no, it
work that
doesn't.
effectively.
And you
But
can't just dump buckets of antibiotics in the ocean and expect that to go well.
as part of the coral restoration, what the biologists are doing, they're identifying those particular stony corals. And when we talk about stony corals, what we're talking about are brain corals
Mhm.
and star corals, mountainous star corals. These are going to be very slow growing. They're going to be mounded kind of corals or the big round corals that you might
Yes.
think about seeing in the bottom. Some of these were thousands of years old
Yeah.
and when they died off, but there are survivors. And then the
Okay.
question is, why are these surviving? And when you get into the genetic makeup and try to isolate out the genes that might be responsible for it, then
Mhm.
that's a whole nother field of
Oh,
specialized
yeah.
study. But what they're doing is they're taking those small corals and then they're going to cut them up and they're actually going to take like a rock saw and
Mm-hmm.
cut these corals into smaller pieces and mount them on tiles. Now, in the process of actually cutting them, they are actually stimulating growth
Okay.
because it
Yeah.
turns out that these corals are snapping and cracking all the time.
You can hear them underwater all
Exactly.
the time if it's not parrotfish.
And so
Yeah,
corals react just like our bones do. When you
that's
break
right.
them, it stimulates growth. They're able to stimulate growth and then grow these in like laboratories where they're
Mm-hmm.
able to have very controlled conditions until they get to the point to where they could go out and plant them on the reef. Normally, these corals are going to be growing. It might start out about the size of a nickel, and over about 5 years, it might be the size of a quarter
Right.
or maybe even the size of a small apple. But it's going to take some
Take a
serious
while.
time. So we need to get started on it and get started on it now.
Ah,
There's some exciting news that folks are looking into, and it's called the technique where they're actually going to take
oh, yeah.
spicer genes
Yeah.
and they're actually going to transplant when they can identify
Yeah.
what those genes are to help fight the Skittle D
Mm,
into new coral that's
yes.
propagating. The other exciting research that they're doing is when they can find these coral colonies that have survived,
Mm,
then they'll go out and collect the gamete from it and
mm-hmm.
grow those also in the
Right.
lab.
Right.
And I had an opportunity to see that when I
Okay.
was visiting the reef coral restoration in Bonaire, the reef renewal.
And
I was
Bonaire.
actually able to go in their lab, and they had just had some of these gametes that had
Mm,
propagated and were beginning to lay down on these small ceramic placards that they had
okay.
that were in the shape of a star, and you could actually see it under a microscope, and it looked like a little tiny volcano as they were laying down the calcium. And when you fluoresce it with a fluorescent light and looked at it with specialized glasses, you could see a coral polyp beginning its life. And it was
Right.
so cool
That
to
is
be able to see
cool.
that research. And then they'll grow those in the lab initially or in situ where they're going to take those out and plant them on the coral reef. And they're doing experiments to find out what conditions are working best to be able to do this. Right. Yeah.
That's at least encouraging to know. Have they been able to find anything in the lab that's a natural antidote or a biological phagocyte that can eat the virus or the
Yeah.
bacteria?
That
Certainly.
research that you're asking about
Okay.
is continuing to go on. They probably have identified a whole group of what they call road bacterial
Mm,
that is kind of responsible for that, to
right.
be able to get down to the specific species and then to
Right.
understand under what conditions they flourish
Mm,
or they can be diminished. The problem is trying to apply an antidote in
mhm.
water that is always moving is a challenge. So that's the reason why most of the most exciting research is being done through asexual promulgation,
Mhm.
which is the cutting,
Right.
and then the sexual promulgation, which is collecting the gametes. So the primary organizations leading the research on the sexual promulgation for the heat-tolerant corals in the Caribbean is called SECOR
Mhm.
International, and it stands for Sexual Coral Reproduction, and it's a collaboration with a group called FEMOR out of Dominican Republic, and then Cambia out of Curacao. And they use this coral seeding technique.
Yeah.
And it's really pretty cool because, as I was explaining in the lab, once they get these corals to begin to grow on these stars, then they will actually transplant them onto what looks like a blue raft. And the raft has a floor on it, and they're able to put these on the floor, and it is screened
Mhm.
so it will get the light coming through this blue filter, which allows it to grow very rapidly, but also protects it against overheating until they can establish this coral. And then they can take that and transplant it
How
onto the
cool.
coral.
Okay.
But it's a really cool organization. And as
That's
I
very good. Sure.
found out about this and then found out that Bonaire actually had the reef renewal program that they had started. They'd brought that in from Florida, and that I was able to go and take a class on
Mhm.
actually how to do this.
Yeah, that is so neat. The NOAA site said that coastal development and human activity are also linked to the increased spread of this disease. And you and I both know, living here in South Carolina that we're not going to stop coastal development. That's never going to happen. I think anywhere there's water, there's going to be people. Of course, maybe we can reduce fertilizer runoff in the oceans, other pollutants that we dump in the ocean. But we talk about the oceans are really the world's largest toilet. And there are a lot of people who feel like, oh, what difference does it make? It's going to clean itself anyway. So if the United States and maybe a few other countries are the only ones that are involved in doing something, how do we get everyone around the world to start taking action and cleaning up their acts?
Okay.
A lot to unpack.
So to begin with, the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts here in the United States that were initiated many years ago really have addressed quite a few of these issues. One of the big issues that's still remaining is the amount of phosphates and nitrates that are being flushed down the Mississippi River, which has led to a huge dead zone that basically goes from Louisiana to Texas and comes and goes each year as we have runoff off of these lands and as the water begins to warm up. And what happens is that these nitrates and phosphates give rise to rapid bacterial growth within the water column. And then as these organisms begin to consume all the other nutrients within the water and deplete the oxygen, then these organisms drop out of the water. We have very little oxygenated water. And so fish and crustaceans like shrimp have a very difficult time. And so this is definitely being monitored or was being monitored by NOAA. And what they're looking at in the future, and I'm not as familiar about this, but changing our farming practices to more regenerative farming practices. And we're starting to see it already in the Midwest where it was corn, or dirt.
Right.
Well, now they're starting to have either cover crops or other crops that are able to come in to help replenish the soil, add more nitrates back to the soil with legumes, so lentils, those kinds of things. And then those crops can be plowed under, and then that helps to make dirt into soil, which has living organisms in it that requires less of these chemical nutrients. So that's kind of some exciting things that are happening. And around the world, you're seeing the same emphasis throughout Europe. There is a concern in the Indonesia and other places where they're having big oil palms, plantations that have been planted. And that's more of siltation where you have a lot of runoff. And then this will just cover the corals and suffocate.
The mangroves act as a natural filter system for a lot of the reefs. And
so when you talk about mangroves, how important they are in terms of being that filtration, but when you have coastal development and you have the reduction of mangroves, then that has led to some problems.
Absolutely.
But there is a UN program to really work on adding those mangroves back to those natural areas where they're at. Literally, there was a organization that has donated $1 billion to this particular project, and you're starting to see replenishment throughout the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. And so that's great to see that happening.
Absolutely. And we've talked about high water temperatures, thermal stress being a big deal for this spread of this disease. So tell us about the exciting new developments in the heat-resistant corals that are being worked on and that can be planted in the damaged reef systems.
Oh, my goodness. And this research is, again, happening throughout the world.
Right.
The Bott Institute in Florida has done a tremendous amount of work in this particular area, as SECOR also has done. The great news is that we have identified species that look to be more heat resistant.
Okay.
The other good news is that where we talk about 90% of the corals disappearing, possibly within this decade because of heat stress, there are areas on the planet that we know that tend to be more resistant. And in the Indo-Pacific, you have cold upwelling waters that come in that help cool some of the corals. The thought process is that in these particular areas that you're going to have corals that will hang on, and then as we're able to sort this out and to be able to transplant it. The other great thing is that we're beginning to see companies move from academic institutes because with limited funding and doing primary research, they're not really designed in order to upscale this by 10 times and go out to planet.
Right.
But there are commercial companies now that are being able to contract with governments and other organizations to be able to commercialize this and to go out and to
Mm-hmm.
do wide-scale, transplanting on corals. That's
Absolutely.
pretty cool to see.
That is. That's wonderful. So if I'm a diver, a snorkeler, a swimmer, or just somebody who loves our oceans and marine life, how can I get involved and make a difference?
Well, first, I think we all need to be aware of the appropriate use of sunscreen
Sure.
because we know that those sunscreens that have a benzene in them are going to be detrimental to corals. In these areas, let's make sure that we're using the appropriate sunscreen for where we're going. In heaven's sakes, do use sunscreen. My
Right.
goodness.
Of course.
Living in the South, I have a dermatology appointment twice a year
Of
because I'm in the sun all the
course.
time, and they've carved plenty off of me. Next, be aware of the plastics that
Mm-hmm.
might be out there. Walking around, and if you do see some stuff that you can pick up, participate in beach cleanups. I participated during Earth Day for
Mm-hmm.
a couple of beach cleanups here in South Carolina, working with the Charleston Waterkeepers. Just
Uh-huh.
a terrific organization. I
Okay.
need to do a shout out.
All right.
The other thing is that be involved with your local communities in
Mm-hmm.
terms of, for example, being involved with Charleston Waterkeepers. I'm helping with oyster restoration here
Yeah.
in the Low Country. That's helping to clean up our coastal waters.
Yeah.
And look in your own communities to see what other organizations. There's waterkeepers all throughout the country. Another great organization is Surf Riders that
Mm-hmm.
you might be able to get involved with. They do tremendous work. If you're a scuba diver, there are classes, PADI class that you can
Mm-hmm.
take on coral restoration and then SSI courses on coral identification that also will cover a lot of the material we talked about here today.
Nice. I love that. What if I am just a person who's like, gee, I'd like to give a financial donation to one of these organizations that is working to combat these diseases or to support the research? Do you know of any organizations that are capable of taking financial donations?
Yes, I do. The Coral Alliance
Okay.
is a good one. Coral Restoration Foundation is
Hmm.
another good organization. We've mentioned Reef Renewal
Okay.
is another great organization. And then Sea Corps would be probably the fourth organization.
All
So
right.
the Coral Alliance, I believe, is a Florida-based, is the Coral Foundation. So
That's wonderful news to have as well. And if our listeners are interested in learning how to dive or upgrade their diving skills, or they want to take a diving trip with you to an exotic location around the world, where can they find you locally?
well, you can find me at Carolina Dive Locker at 1303 Ben Sawyer Boulevard here in Mount Pleasant, and we are a full-service shop. And we would invite you to come visit if you're a scuba diver. We have a wide range of equipment, full service, meaning that we can service your equipment. I'm only one of 3 service technicians here. So, and if you need a quick turnaround, let us know. We can see what we can do for you. But let's not forget that we also have opportunities for travel to locations such as Roatan, been to the
Absolutely.
Galapagos, been to British Virgin Islands. Look us up at carolinadivelocker.com or drop by the shop and have a conversation with us, or you can contact us at 843-884-1500.
And one more time.
That would be 843-884-1500. My website, the work I'm doing in terms of marine conservation is See the Sea, SEE-THE-SEA.com. So See the Sea, and the thought is if I can see it, I can relate to it. If I can relate to it, I can fall in love with it. If I can fall in love with it, I can protect it.
That's great. I want to thank Denny for being a fantastic guest today on our show. And the great news is that I'm going to have Denny back on to talk about his favorite diving locations around the world and share with all of you who like to dive and perhaps just snorkel even, because I know there are divers out there who used to love to dive and for whatever health reasons, they can't dive anymore, but they can snorkel. Then also, Denny is going to talk about some of his top travel hacks from his time as a SEER instructor. And if you don't know what SEER means, that's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. And he's going to talk about things that he really wouldn't leave home without when he's traveling. Denny, it's been a pleasure.
Well, great. Been great talking with you, and enjoy connecting with your audience.
Fantastic. For those of you who have joined us, thank you so much. As always, you can reach out to me at Shannon at A Lady Well Traveled. That's Shannon at A Lady Well Traveled with 2 L's in traveled. And I'd love to know what you think about the show. If you have any questions for Denny, please reach out to him at his website, contact Carolina Dive Locker. Again, we're so appreciative of them letting us record here today, and would encourage you to check out their website and all the great things that they have to offer. And as always, I just want to remind you that God created this big, beautiful world out there just for you. All you need to do is get out there and see it. So until next time, bye-bye.